Let's take a look at it. Preparing for post-pandemic, which at some point is supposed to happen. Actually, I think I heard something this week that it's actually potentially, maybe officially post-pandemic. We still got the Rona around, and who knows what else will happen. But if I don't have to wear a mask on the plane anymore, which I don't, that's a big sign. So whether it happens or it doesn't, here's what's going to happen. Here's how we start getting ready for it. So here's the deal. Right now, people are spending most of their time in two extreme places. Isolated on the one hand and engaged in mass and social media on the other. Before pandemic, we were doing it voluntarily. And then for several months, depending on where you live and what the regulations were, up to a year or more, but certainly for a certain period of time, we couldn't do it. It wasn't voluntary anymore. It was involuntary. It was about the only way to connect with people for a certain period of time. And for our friends who are living in several places in Europe and Australia, and I've got friends there, they're like, and Canada, you think our lockdowns were tough. Wow. Some of them still aren't unlocked yet. It's been pretty severe. And so what happened was we were already coming home, not talking to our neighbors, and thinking that we were in relationship because we're talking to people on social media. And some of us actually developed relationships on social media. There are people in this room that are like, oh yeah, it's you. We get to meet in real life for the first time. But there is something about the actual in person that means it's an actual relationship now, right? We all know that. Okay, so what's the answer to those two extremes? What we need is the middle ground of community. Community is the answer. People think they're in relationships with people simply because they argue with them online. And they're not. The middle ground of community, and of course the wonderful part about that is there is no better place on the face of the earth to get the community that is an answer to this problem than in a healthy small church. It is the absolute answer to be in relationship with Christ, to be in relationship with each other, to develop genuine, real-life community that pulls us out of isolation and that helps us to realize the shallowness of something I engage in. I engage in mass and social media. I enjoy it. There's good things that happen there, but let's recognize that's not where we should be spending your time. If you're only spending your time in those two extremes, it's really unhealthy. And we have the opportunity in the church now especially, because before that it was voluntary. And then when it became involuntary, now we've got people looking around and they're recognizing the shallowness of this more than they recognized it before because they were forced into it. So I think right now people are recognizing the problems of living in isolation on one side and mass and social media on the other side. It's always been problematic. They're recognizing the problem now, so we as the church get to step into the gap and answer what is now a more recognized need than it was before. So let's take a look at what is happening in some churches. I believe there are two keys to recovery after the pandemic. Key number one is this: don't try to go back to what was. I'm talking to too many pastors, hearing from too many of them. We just want everybody back. We want all the programs back again. We just want everything back to normal again. Time doesn't move in that direction. Time travel is real. It is. But we're all traveling at the same pace in the same direction. You can't go backwards. That's all. You're traveling through time. You just can't go that way. That's all, right? There's a reason why when you sit in your car, the rear view mirror is 8 inches wide and the windshield is 6 feet wide. Because if you're trying to drive through the just using the rear view mirror, you're going to have problems. You're going to cause accidents. It's not meant to go that direction. So it's there for a reason. We should know. We should build on our history. We just talked about that. But it's so that we can continue to move forward. Don't try to go back to what was. So what do we do instead? You got to build on what you're learning. Build on what you're learning. My dad taught me this. When I was younger, one of my first jobs, we were living in Modesto, California, which is in the Central Valley of California. It's one of the most largest and deepest agricultural places in the world. We grow more oranges than Florida, more peaches than Georgia, more almonds than anywhere else on the face of the earth. Walnuts, grapes, you name it. It's just an amazing agricultural area. It's just filled with farms and ranches everywhere. So one of my first jobs was at a peach processing plant graveyard shift. Yeah. So I showed up and they put me on the belt, and my job was, it's after the cutter, after they've sliced and gone through the machine that takes the pit out, the depitter. My job was to catch any where the pit did not come out, pull the pit out, put it back on. That was my job. So I'm doing this and just, okay, fine. It's boring, but this is fine. What I didn't realize was that for the first couple hours, the belt is moving. But after the first couple hours, it feels like you're moving. And it's serious vertigo. And the old guys always loved putting the new guys on the belt. It was entertaining for them, apparently. And especially this, at the time, young and skinny, tall tower, they were just waiting to see me topple. That was going to be just great. And finally, one person had sympathy on me and came over and said, okay, come on, sit down. Put your head between your knees for a while. When you're feeling better, let me know, okay? He said, we'll put you on another place, get you off the belt for now. And he put me at the end where my job was to pick out the rotten peaches. Yeah, and I spent my entire night doing that. So I get home in the morning, my dad gets up, he sees me coming in, he goes, so how was first night on the job? I goes, it's terrible and I hate it. He goes, yeah, but what did you learn from it? I learned that it's terrible and I hate it. Okay. Next morning, same question. It's terrible and I hate it. What else did you learn? I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Okay. Next morning, same question. What else did you learn? It's terrible and I hate it. Don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I guess probably better ought to stay in school so I can learn how to do something other than this for the rest of my life. Yeah, now you're getting it, right? And that was my dad's thing. Whenever you go through anything, especially if you go through a difficult season, you better learn something from it. In fact, we learn more from the difficult seasons than we do from the good ones. We have been through a really, really difficult season, a once in a century season. Like, this is the first time the entire world has experienced the same trauma since World War II. Think about that. Right? There have been localized traumas that have been worse than this, but a global trauma, first time since World War II. That is not insignificant. We'll talk about that in the next session, what that actually has done to us and how it's rewired us in some ways and how we can get healing out of that. But you got to build on what you're learning. I'm looking at it and thinking, you know what? This last 2 years took stuff out of me. I lost friends. My brain still isn't what it used to be. It affected my brain. It did. It changed my behaviors. It affected the way I think. It affected my emotional stability. It did in ways that I didn't recognize until I was deep into it. It's just, I'm an introvert. I get to stay home. Woo! And yeah, not so much after a while, right? It got to me. But I'm determined. Here's the deal. This pandemic took a lot out of me. But I'm determined I'm going to take more out of it than it took out of me. And the only way I know to do that is I'm going to learn everything I can from it. If we approach it correctly, this last 2 years can be like a 10-year accelerated course in leadership and in life and in ministry. If we take it that way, if we look at it, if we just simply can't wait till it's over, well then when it's over and when pain is over, if you don't learn anything, then all you have is the pain. I'm not going to leave with only the pain. I'm going to take more out of it than it took out of me. I'm going to suck everything out of the marrow of this that I can. I'm going to learn everything possible. I'm going to learn everything I can. I'm going to build on it for the glory of God. And if we take it that way, it can be exactly that. That doesn't negate the negative, but I think it can outweigh the negative. But only if we purposely approach it that way. So how do we start doing that? Let's take a look at some things. First of all, in small churches especially, but I think in every church we need to do this. There are three things we need to do. One, we need to respond contextually. We need to respond contextually. I used to say that our churches need to be relevant, and I don't use the term relevant anymore. And here's why. I still think churches do need to be relevant, but the problem is the word relevant has taken on so much baggage over the last 20 years. And so now when people say your church needs to be relevant, you know what the average small church pastor hears? You're saying the church needs to be relevant. We hear, my church needs to be cool. That's what we hear. That may not be what's intended, but that's what we hear. And we don't need any more cool churches. We need churches that understand our context. So especially after these last couple of years, we need to look around outside of our churches. What is the current context of our community? It has changed in the last 2 years more than it would have changed in any previous decade. That is the amount of change that's happened. I'm convinced that the pandemic did not change anything. It simply accelerated and amplified changes that were already in place. It sped them up to a degree. I mean, we thought we were moving fast, but this last 2 years is ballistic, right? So we've got to respond contextually. You know, it's like a bear coming out of hibernation, looking around and going, okay, where am I, right? Where are we? And we've got to understand the context that we're in so that we can respond to it best. The churches that are doing best right now are understanding and ministering to the current context rather than just wishing it was the way it used to be. So you got to respond contextually. Secondly, you got to minister personally. Minister personally. In smaller churches, especially, low tech matters more than high tech. Yes, at the beginning of pandemic, especially, a lot of churches had to get online. Our church was not live streaming at the beginning of pandemic. We talked about it. We knew we should be doing it, but it didn't have the urgency to get us to do it. And then on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, I think it was a Wednesday, the governor of California said, nope. Ain't nobody meeting in churches, in bars, in restaurants, in movie theaters, in concert venues. Everybody's staying inside for at least the next 6 weeks. And we went, we got to figure out how to do church without going to church. And we had like 4 days to pull together all the stuff that we needed to do to pull it together. And God bless them, they figured it out. But here's the deal. Once we got that set up, people, once they knew they could observe the service on Sunday, that was not the main ministry we did. The main ministry we did was we rediscovered. Did you realize there's still a phone on this?
Yeah. There's still a phone on it, yes.
I had no idea. We rediscovered the phones on our phones. And we started ministering personally. We started doing things so that when this is all over 5-10 years from now and they look back at this, they will not remember how well you framed the shot for your live stream. They will remember the call they got from their pastor. We had to minister personally. When this first happened and the shutdown happened, we framed failure for our staff. We said, failure for us will be when we come out of this, if anybody says, nobody reached out to me during the shutdown, that will be the definition of failure for us. Nobody is going to be able to say that at the end of this. We ministered personally. Secondly, you got to prepare continually. I have bad news for you. 4 words of bad news. This will happen again. Maybe not a pandemic, hopefully not. But we live in a broken world where bad things happen. It's not a matter of if something bad's coming, but when and what it'll be. At some point, it's going to be a tornado. It's going to be a freeze. It's going to be an earthquake. It's going to be a flood. There's going to be a fire. The biggest business in town will close down. Right? Something's coming through. We don't know when, but we know it's coming. We live in a broken world where bad things happen. So what can we learn from the way we prepared well and the ways we might not have prepared well for this most recent crisis? How do we learn from that to prepare better for the next crisis? Because another crisis is coming. We don't know which direction the wave is coming from. We don't know what size it's going to be. But if you act like it's not coming, that's not faith, that's disillusionment, that's fantasy land, okay? So how do we start to prepare for the next one? What I've done is I've talked to so many churches that did well during this one, and I've learned from them what helped them do well. And there's 4 key things that distinguishes the churches that on the one side did well and thrived, and on the other side, churches that struggled or even closed during this. So I'm going to walk you through these 4 key things from the churches I've talked to. First one is this: resources in reserve. Resources in reserve. When the pandemic first hit, all of a sudden we had 6 weeks where people weren't in the building. We had online options for giving, but we hadn't really emphasized it. And we had to expend a whole bunch of money on equipment to be able to live stream the services. And there was a high expenses and really low giving for 6 to 8 weeks. And we went through it fine. Here's how. Been at the church for 29 years. For the first 15 years, as a typical small church, we were month to month on the bills, and an occasional tight season, barely week to week, right? We're not sure we can pay our salary this week, Pastor. We're going to have X amount in the offering, or because we got to pay the light bill. And each time we made it, just barely, but I got tired of doing that. So I went to our leadership and I said, here's the deal. I want us to be more purposeful about this. I want to be better stewards of the resources God has given us. I want us to take 10% of general fund money and put it into a special account. We'll put a line item in the budget for it. And we will keep putting money in there, 10% a month, until we reach three months worth of budget in the bank so that we have that cushion. I believe that's good stewardship. They agreed, so we did it. I said, if we do that, 10% every month, that's 2.5 years. We'll have 3 months worth. So let's give ourselves 3 years to accomplish the job. Great, awesome. It took us 10 years. Why? Because we were already tight. And some months we didn't have any. And another month the water heater broke and we had to fix it. So money kept coming in, going out. But we kept at it. And at the 10-year point about there, we had our 3 months in reserve. And that was about 5-6 years ago. So when pandemic hit and we couldn't have money coming in, what did we do? That's what it's there for. This is a seriously rainy day, folks. We pulled it out. We bought what we needed to do. We didn't have to go, oh, the sky is falling. We need money. If you don't do this, we're going to. No, we just pulled it out. And then we told them afterwards, by the way, folks, we had to spend money on all this stuff. And if we can replenish that, that'd be great. And God bless them. When they came back, they gave it and they put it right back in again because we've created that environment in the church. So resources in reserve, in addition to financial resources, as pastors and as leaders, we need to be building margin into our daily lives and our habits. Too many pastors are running at 100%, and when a disaster happens, they can't do anymore. And so they just fry themselves. And so during a normal ministry season, which is disruptive enough, if you're running at 100% or 90%, you will have got nothing left in the tank when a big disaster hits again. You've got to be running at 60, 70% tops. You've got to give yourself a lot of space for recovery so that when a difficult season happens, you've got something that you can add to it. We need to put resources in reserve. Speaking of that margin, second big point is this: team-based leadership. Team-based leadership. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had some emails from small church pastors that I never thought I'd get. 3 of them actually texted me with basically the same message. People are now volunteering to help out who've never volunteered before because the need is so obvious and so immediate. And I don't know what to have them do because I do everything. Right now, I get what that's like. I've spent way too many years doing everything. I told you about it already. When we were a church group of 400 to 400, it was because we were doing it all. We were burning ourselves out. We'll talk about how to get some of that fixed in later sessions today. But we got to get the team-based leadership going. The churches that had team-based leadership, who then, first of all, when the pandemic hit, it wasn't all on one person's shoulders. There were multiple shoulders to share the burden. And then when new people stepped up, you had a place to put them. So team-based leadership is biblical. It's Ephesians 4, which again we'll talk about later. That our job is to equip God's people for works of service, to build teams around us. That is one of our primary tasks. I would say it's our primary task as the pastor. We got to get team-based leadership. So for the next one, let's get started on that. Third one, adaptability. There's some churches that have a very limited and restricted view of what church means. For some churches, for some people in those churches, church is this. Church is meeting in this building at this time, singing these songs, wearing these clothes with this denominational tag on the building, and only lasts this long, and we get out at this time so we can beat the Baptist to lunch.
You got it.
Right? Here's the deal. The more gottas you put on that list, the more vulnerable you make your church. Because when pandemic hit, all of a sudden we couldn't meet in this building at this time wearing these clothes, right? We couldn't do it anymore. And then we've got people all over the country screaming, I can't believe the governor closed down our churches. This is an assault on our liberty. They're closing down the churches. Nonsense. Not a single governor, not a single president, not a single prime minister, not a single king, not a single dictator anywhere in the world closed down a single church. They don't have that power. Don't give it to them. They closed our buildings. But my theology says that doesn't stop the church because the building isn't the church. Right now, we can have all the arguments we want about whether they overstepped and all that, but that's a separate thing over here. We keep conflating the two, and they're not the same. That's a different argument. It's a valid argument to have. But nobody closed down any church. So the churches that had already gotten the idea that we can adapt our methods. We can change it up here. We can change it up there. We're staying true to the gospel. Hey, our community has changed. They don't hear things this way anymore. They hear things that way now. So why don't we change our language so that they can hear the truths of the gospel using language that they, in a way they now communicate. The ones that were already doing the adapting, they had no problem with this at all. They did well. The ones that had locked it down, some of them closed their doors for good because they couldn't function outside the building. Adaptability has to be built in everything we do. And then fourthly, unity. If you pick up my book, The Church Resource Guide today, you're only going to see the first 3 in there because, well, you'll know why in a moment. Moody got a hold of me, my publisher, and said, we want to put out a couple of books that'll help people during this season. Have you got a couple ideas you can put together? And I'll see what I can do. And I wrote the thing ridiculously fast. It's just a booklet because it's so quick. Because we thought this thing would be over at some point. So it came out a little over a year ago. Well, a little more than that. You'll know why in a moment. You'll know exactly why in a moment. I sent it in, and the week that I sent it in was the week that George Floyd was killed. And as we're seeing what happened in response to that and what was happening on the streets of America to that, I thought maybe I should pull that book back and add something else to it. And then I thought, you know what? The Lord knew when I was going to send my book in, and he knew when that was going to happen. And I think that's his way of saying, Carl, that's not your thing to talk about. So I didn't, at least not in book form. And so I didn't. And what we watched out of that was in previous disasters, go back to say 9/11, for instance, we all pulled together. There was an overwhelming unity. In this one, because it was one thing after another, which we'll talk about after lunch in the trauma session, it changes things. It changes the way we think. It changes the way we relate to each other. And of all the things that happened during a pandemic, the thing that breaks my heart the most, because I'm convinced it breaks Jesus' heart the most, is that during a difficult season, the church didn't come together. We splintered apart. And we splintered apart over important things like race and over trivial things like masks. And we had arguments over stuff we never thought we'd argue over before, and we refused to step up and have important conversations over important stuff, or we just yelled at each other instead of actually having the conversation. We need to be united around the mission, not unity instead of the mission, but unity around the mission. We need to understand what's happening. Now, in our church, for instance, you got people on any side of any issue you want to name, because we've got mature Christians, we got not yet Christians, we got people who just became Christians and are still trying to figure it out, and even among mature Christians, we still have disagreements because they just come to different conclusions about stuff. Who'd have thought? We got along. We didn't have any big arguments. We didn't have a church split. Not over masks, not over vaccinations, not over race, not over theology, not over sexuality. We haven't had a single split over any of this stuff. Why? Because we keep coming back to it's about the mission, it's about the mission, it's about the mission. And we can work together as long as we're united in Christ. These other things will set aside. And here's the deal. When we're about the mission, it will address those other things in the right way instead of chasing after them like the latest trend. So the churches that were united stayed united. The churches that thought they were united around the mission, but were only united around politics, or were only united around a common ethnicity, or were only united around a common tradition, they're the ones who had and are still having a hard time. None of these other things is enough to unite us. Only the mission of Jesus is enough to unite us. Only Christ and him crucified is enough to unite us. The churches that thought they were united but were united around any of these other things are having a harder time. That's what we need to come back to and stick with. All right? I got one more thing, but before we do, remind you of what is coming up. After lunch, we are going to talk about this whole emotional and spiritual trauma we've been through, how it connects to biblical principles and how it connects even to brain chemistry. Then the next decade, scouting report from boots on the ground pastors, what's coming up next, and then how to discover and use what your church does well. This is when we'll get into defining what a healthy church looks like, how to find that one thing that you're called to do. That'll be our last session, and the books. And then here's how we'll conclude before we break for lunch. When times are normal, leaders inspire change. For 40 plus years now, first of all as a student of church leadership, and now as still a student, but now as a teacher of church leadership, most of the church leadership that has been taught to me, and a whole bunch of the church leadership that I have taught, has been around how to bring change to a stuck church. How to get them out of their comfort zone and into mission again. It's been all about how do we get this thing rolling again? How do we move this thing? How do we get it changing again? Why? Because for the last 40 years or so, things have been relatively normal. Yeah, we've had challenges. Yes, we've had difficulties. But it's been a fairly normal season of time, and people have gotten a little too comfortable. So for most pastors, trying to get people motivated has been our challenge. And so that's where most of our leadership has been. Times are normal, leaders inspire change. When times are disruptive, leaders provide stability. We are now coming out of the most disruptive season in our lifetime, and I'm convinced, we'll talk about this in the next two sessions, I believe we're coming into a time of potentially greater disruption of different types as we have the fallout from what we've dealt with in the last 2 years. I think we've got some really challenging things coming our way. We are not at the end of a disruptive period. We are in the middle of the most disruptive period of our lifetimes. So people right now are not looking for more changes. They've got plenty, thank you very much. What they're looking for is stability through the change to the other side. So we have to pivot our leadership style. We have to have more than one type of leadership in our toolbox. And so we've got, now, will there be opportunities for change? In fact, yes, there will be. In fact, it's one of the things that's often taught right now by other church leaders. I've heard them say, hey, during this season of COVID, blame COVID for the changes. Make this as an opportunity to change. And I agree with some of that. For instance, if during the lockdowns and pandemic you had to stop doing certain ministries and you haven't started them all back up again, way back to our starter, don't try to go back to what was. In fact, take a look at it and go, if we didn't miss it, maybe we shouldn't start it up again. It's way easier not to restart a ministry than it is to stop one that's been restarted. So look around. That window may have closed for some of you, but if that window is still open, take opportunity for it. But that's really just, it's a moment of opportunity. For the most part, though, what people are looking for is a calm, reasoned, loving, biblical, shepherding voice and presence. Something they can rely on in a time of the greatest disruption of their lives, where everybody else is yelling about something and everybody else is demanding something and everybody else is uncertain about it, and people make predictions that are wrong, and people say this one day and then they change it the next day, and it turns out they were lying all along, and I don't know who to trust anymore, and we're going to get into some of how that even affects our brains in the next session. What they need is a pastoral presence that says, I've been standing here all the time, and I'm going to stand here more, and I'm going to learn whatever I can to help us get through this, but come to a place where we can just love on Jesus and love on each other, know that he loves us, know that we love each other, that we're going to hear scripture, that we're going to receive comfort that we need in our times of trouble. So a stable way through the difficulty is what people are looking for now more than a disruptive time. We've got enough disruption already. So the question, of course, is how do we unite people when everybody seems to be at each other's throats lately? And why have they been so upset lately? And that's what we'll talk about in our first after lunch section, is that whole, how has this stuff actually rewired and restructured our brains? How has God built our brains to recover from trauma? And how can we help our people understand where they are, what they've experienced, and how to find their way back to health again by the scriptural code of the renewing of our minds.